Without further ado, let's start the final round of International Extemporaneous Speaking. Speaking first is code 5216. Answering the question, is conflict-driven displacement straining international refugee systems?
Amal Hussein, only 7 years old, lay weak and fragile on a hospital bed in northern Yemen. After being displaced by violence in her own country, the international community was her only hope of survival. As the International Rescue Committee explains on June 10th of this year, Amal is one of 118 million people who were forcibly displaced because of conflict raging within their countries. Whether it's the rapid support forces in Sudan, Ukrainian citizens dying in a war against Russia, or Yemen with the Houthi rebels, it seems that refugees everywhere are in desperate need of help. But this comes at a time where major aid organizations and international refugee systems, namely the United Nations, are facing major funding shortages and pullbacks. About $3.45 billion of funding to refugee systems was pulled back this last year alone from the UN, prompting concern over the future of refugees and their survival. But it's when considering that Amnesty International explains to us just last week that the only chance of survival for people like Amal Hussein is what the international community could do for them, that it becomes for her survival we must ask the question, is conflict-driven displacement straining international refugee systems? The answer is absolutely, because these systems are unprepared to deal with an influx of refugees, shown through first, the outdated 1951 Refugee Convention. Second, major shortages in funding. And third and finally, the fact that systems cannot protect themselves from violence. In a way, Amal Hussein could be considered lucky to have experienced so much violence in her life, because it classifies her as an internally displaced refugee. But thousands of other economic migrants can't say the same, marking the first reason as to why conflict-driven displacement is straining international refugee systems, because of the outdated 1951 Refugee Convention. As the London School of Economics and Political Science explains on March 25th of this year, the 1951 Refugee Convention was once a boon for the international community. Essentially, it established what a refugee was, what type of rights they could have, and how they could progress in the international context. However, it was designed with World War II in mind, rather than contemporary waves of migration and refugees, meaning it simply classifies a refugee as someone who has fled their country to escape persecution. But it ignores some 41.6 million economic migrants who are also escaping violence. Because as the Council on Foreign Relations themselves explains on August 12th of last year, economic migrants, those moving to new countries for economic objectives, can also be those escaping violence. However, in the case of Venezuela and Ecuador, when Venezuelans were fleeing Ecuador trying to get new jobs and economic opportunities, they weren't provided any systems or support from the international refugee system because they weren't legally classified by the 1951 Refugee Convention as refugees, demonstrating how an outdated convention is causing millions of refugees and asylum seekers to be excluded from aid systems that they desperately need because their pursuit of a job outweighs the tragedy that they've experienced in their lives, demonstrating how conflict-driven displacement will only continue to strain a system that isn't prepared to deal with an influx of migrants. But Amal Hussein also received a tray of food and a bed when she entered a hospital in northern Yemen. These were considered luxuries for her, provided by the international communities, simple luxuries that thousands of others might not have in the future, marking the second reason as to how conflict-driven displacement is straining the international refugee system because of major floods in Kunding. As the UNHCR explains in their 2026 report, both the United Nations and refugee systems domestically, including those in Germany, Denmark, the United Kingdom, Japan, and the United States, are in need of some $8.5 billion funding to respond to humanitarian crises and aid refugees all across the world. However, because of both a rise in conflict and the fact that domestic objectives from countries like the United States are causing them to contribute less to aid organizations, there isn't enough funding to help all the people in need. As ReliefWeb explains on June 12th, it seems that while a whopping amount of aid is needed, countries like Germany and the United States are pulling out their funding from major organizations like the UN, which causes the UN to estimate that some 50% of its refugee systems will be dismantled in the next decade. Not to mention the fact that already 185 offices across the globe have closed, and a 50% decrease in initiatives for refugees has occurred as well, demonstrating how as funding decreased as simultaneously the amount of refugees increases, the international refugee system is inadequately prepared to deal with this influx, something that would cost the lives of thousands of citizens. But third and finally, last November when Amal Hussein died, it wasn't because aid didn't exist, but because violence from the Saudi Arabian Houthi rebels prevented an aid convoy from landing at her own hospital. This marks the third and final reason as to how conflict-driven displacement is straining international refugee systems, because the systems themselves cannot protect themselves from violence. As the Human Rights Watch explains, on April 17th of last year, it seems that although aid organizations default to food, water, and sanitation projects when trying to aid citizens, they vastly underestimate the amount of violence that their own personnel would be facing in the process. In some cases, like in Yemen and in the Gaza Strip, it seems they've defaulted to providing cash grants and checks instead of physical resources. However, this still isn't enough. As the aforementioned Amnesty International article continues to explain, it seems that as these systems cannot protect themselves and their aid workers from violence, with 110 aid workers dying in the last year alone, they start hesitating and no longer send aid workers to regions in conflict at all, demonstrating that as the international community fails to equip itself with resources of protection, they also let go of workers that could desperately help refugees in the process, to the detriment of those in need. So when returning to today's question, for the fate of people like Amal Hussein, it becomes imperative we ask, is conflict-driven displacement straining international refugee systems? We see that the answer is absolutely, because these systems are unprepared to respond to an influx of migrants, shown through first, an outdated 1951 Refugee Convention, second, major funding cuts, and third and finally, the system's inability to protect themselves from violence. Amal Hussein didn't deserve to die in a hospital bed because of an aid system that was broken and fractured. But it's only up to the international community to make major strides and improvements so that thousands of others might have a chance of survival.
Speaker number 1 will now be cross-examined by Speaker 6, code 5093.
Great speech. As always, I've just got a few questions.
Awesome.
Let's start on your first point about the 1951 Refugee Convention. You explained that people are currently migrating for economic reasons, but your question is about conflict-driven displacement. Are all of these people migrating for economic reasons falling under the category of conflict-driven displaced people?
Like I mentioned in my first point, 41.6 million economic migrants could also be classified as conflict-driven displaced migrants. However, because the way the 1951 Refugee Convention is set up, it defaults to referring to them as economic migrants rather than conflict-displaced ones. This leaves a major lapse of people who are in need of refugee support and aid, but because of a legal restriction, cannot receive it.
So are those people leaving for economic reasons also leaving due to conflict?
Yes, the 41.6 million people, like I mentioned in my first point. While all economic migrants aren't necessarily ones leaving due to conflict, some of these ones who are leaving due to conflict can also be classified as economic migrants as well.
Let's move to your second point about funding. Recently, there have been several advances in technology that help refugees. For example, crops that offer higher yields. So even if organization funding is decreasing, isn't the funding being used more efficiently?
While innovation might help use funding effectively, funding is still needed to make sure innovation happens and can be applied in international refugee systems. When $8.9 billion are needed to support refugees across the world, but this funding doesn't exist in the first place or is vastly decreasing, we can't even apply innovative solutions to help refugees in the first place.
Let's move to your third point, where you briefly discuss the Houthi rebels. Your question is about conflict-driven displacement and not conflict itself. So is the reason that these organizations are struggling because of the conflict or the displacement?
Conflict-driven displacement and the extent to which refugees are leaving a particular country and the influx of refugees are what is specifically putting strain on international organizations. While conflict itself is targeting these organizations, because they're decreasing the amount of refugee systems they can put out and the amount of aid workers they can send, conflict will only continue to rage on.
Thank you.
Speaking second is code 5092 with the question, should India avoid deeper alignment with Western blocs?
The relationship between Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Russian President Vladimir Putin has been strangely intimate as of late. At a recent summit in New Delhi, Putin told Modi, and I quote, "Один день ощущается как 3 осени." Or, in English, one day apart feels like 3 autumns. I know, when I read that, I had to double check to make sure I wasn't seeing the script to a slow burn K-drama. Talk about international relations, am I right? And yet it seems like Putin's attempts to woo Modi are working, because despite American pressure, India isn't aligning closer with the West. As the New Indian Express explains 2 weeks ago, that despite the US Trump administration placing unprecedented pressure on India in the form of tariffs to align with Western blocs, like the European Union or America's other allies, India has resisted. It continues to pursue the strategic policy that it has for decades, ever since its independence almost 80 years ago. Strategic autonomy, where it balances alliances between the West and the West's geopolitical opponents, allowing it to reap the benefits of all countries involved without getting bogged down in anyone's individual affairs. However, as we enter a new geopolitical intersection, many experts are now wondering whether or not this strategic autonomy is even valid any longer. So, it's when considering that the question of India's alignment might just determine whether or not the Western-led world order persists or crumbles. It's with the lives of every single one of us here today in mind that we must ask, should India avoid deeper alignment with Western blocs? The answer is actually an absolute yes, because doing so allows it to maintain its strategic autonomy, which will continue to bring it benefits in 3 key areas of analysis. First, energy security. Second, staying out of global conflicts. And finally, maintaining its role as the leader of the global South. Now, Prime Minister Narendra Modi is well known as a teetotaler. He's never had a drop of alcohol in his life, which has led to many of his supporters remarking that he's not only a strong leader, but also probably one of the few that still has an intact liver. And yet, India is drunk on oil, and it's not sobering up anytime soon. That's why the first key reason as to why India should not pursue deeper alignment with the West is to maintain its energy security. India has great ambitions to become a world superpower. That requires itself to develop a strong manufacturing base and industry. That, in turn, requires exorbitant amounts of energy. An article by the Center for Energy and Clean Air Policy explains to us, published in its May 2026 report, that specifically, India now accounts for more than half of new global oil demand. That oil is not cheapest when it comes from Western allies. It's from countries like Russia. As Politico quantifies on May 7th of this year, that India now purchases 36% of Russian oil exports, amounting to about 5.9 billion euros every single month. That is powering factories across the Indian subcontinent, but it will be cut off if India pursues closer ties with the West. That's because that Russian oil is currently under Western sanction by both the European Union and the United States. India has to either ignore those sanctions or find loopholes around them in the status quo in order to maintain its energy security. But if it chooses closer ties with countries like America or those within the European Union, then it will have to abandon that liquid gold, meaning that its ambitions to become the world's greatest nation might just evaporate and it might be left behind. And yet, the second key reason as to why India cannot pursue deeper alignment with the West is that it has to stay out of new wars. After all, after Ali Khamenei was killed in his complex in Iran earlier this year, Operative found that on his laptop, he apparently had more than 3,000 hours watching the kick streamer Clavicular. Basically, while Ali Khamenei was busy looks maxing, Donald Trump was war maxing, bringing about the costless conflict of 2026. However, if India wants to stay out of these wars, then it has to make sure that it doesn't align with the West. The problem is that India is one of the world's greatest geopolitical hotbeds today. The Center for Strategic and International Studies explains on January 20th that India is located in the Indo-Pacific, where China has been ramping up aggression against its neighbors in the South China Sea, like Taiwan, Vietnam, and the Philippines. Many of these countries are currently allied with the United States and other Western nations. If India allies closer with the West, then it might get pulled into a potential conflict that occurs in the future. And India, even if it chooses not to get involved, will ultimately still be punished. The Guardian describes, for instance, in an article from March 26th of this year, how when Spain chose not to let America use its airspace in order to bomb Iran, Trump threatened to place a trade embargo on the country. Even the West's closest allies are not exempt from military action, and that's a reality that India wants to avoid. So for the peace and prosperity of its citizens, and to keep them away from bloodshed happening across the world, India must ensure that it doesn't align closer with the West. But finally, it seems like India's approach to diplomacy has drawn a lot of inspiration from an ancient Japanese technique, known to us as Pokemon. That's because when it comes to so many countries across the world, India's gotta catch them all. And this is precisely the third and final way that we see them choosing not to align further with the West, because by doing so, they can maintain their role as a leader of the global South. Look to an article by the Chatham House, a think tank where they explain in March of this year that for the past few decades, India has built up an image as a leader of underdeveloped nations across the world. For example, it's formed the BRICS Alliance, or Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which now has dozens of member nations and which has grown India's trade within the bloc by threefold in the past 5 years. Clearly, we see that when India chooses to align with underdeveloped nations in the global South, it stands tremendously to gain. But Western nations aren't such big fans of BRICS. Modern Diplomacy writes on January 23rd of this year that because of member nations within BRICS, like Russia and China, many Western policymakers view the alliance as the antithesis of the West and a threat to the Western world order. India doesn't necessarily buy into the Western world order. It wants to create its own world of multipolarity, where it stands as a leader for the global South. Thus, we clearly see that for so many countries which looked up to India as a beacon for change and progress, India has to fulfill its promises and stick to them as a leader, showing that if you stick with the West, then you might be stuck behind. So, returning to today's all-important question, should India avoid deeper alignment with Western blocs? We've seen that the answer has been an absolute yes, because doing so will allow it to preserve its strategic autonomy, benefiting it in 3 key ways. First, when it comes to energy security. Second, no new wars, but for real, unlike with Trump. And finally, but perhaps most importantly, maintaining its role as a leader of the global South. And so, while I look very much forward to the next episode of the love story between Putin and Modi, one thing is clear. If India does stick with the West, then one day apart might really feel like 3 autumns. Thank you.
Speaker 2 will now be cross-examined by Speaker 1, code 5216.
That was a great speech. I just have a few questions. Starting with your first point, you talk a lot about how India's economy is drunk on oil. Wouldn't moving towards the West in terms of renewable energy and diversification actually help India and its economy?
Well, first of all, India is currently way too reliant on oil to move towards the West. Even if the West were the world's leader in renewables, which it's not, China is, then India would still need to maintain its current supply of oil from Russia, and it's not going to be able to do that if it chooses to align with Western blocs.
Sure. Let's move on to your second point in regards to conflict. You mentioned how India is a part of the BRICS alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And currently, Russia is engaging in conflict with Ukraine, and China is militarizing in the South China Sea. Wouldn't not staying towards the West mean India would militarize and escalate in conflict anyways?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that, because I want to make it clear that when I say India should avoid deeper alignment with the West, that doesn't mean that they align deeper with the geopolitical opponents of the West. India is trying to build a new world order where it is a superpower, and that means that it can't pursue the West. But it also means that it doesn't ally necessarily with Russia or China and get involved in their wars as well.
But you said yourself that India is a part of the BRICS alliance. Doesn't that align them with the geopolitical agenda of these countries?
The BRICS alliance is primarily economic in nature and not military. None of the members have necessarily been involved in Putin's invasion of Ukraine so far, for example.
Sure, let's move to your third point about India being a leader in the global south. When it comes to gaining leverage with developing countries in the global south, a lot of times India and other countries will rely on the West, whether it comes to technology, imports, or exports. Wouldn't moving away from the West threaten their position in the global south?
I wouldn't necessarily say that most countries rely on the West when it comes to increasing influence in the South. The West has actually done a pretty poor job, especially recently with figures like Donald Trump cutting billions of dollars in foreign aid to Africa, for instance. So we clearly see that if India wants to pave a solid way to strengthen its role as a leader of the South, then it has to carve its own path and not try to become reliant on the West, which isn't doing a great job.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you.
Speaking third is code 5086, answering the question, how can the Pacific Islands Forum address climate displacement?
Recently, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has been making a desperate attempt to court young voters. He's been doing this by using a lot of Gen Z slang. Like in a recent parliamentary address, he referred to the opposition as Delulu with no Salulu. And if you don't know what that means, then congratulations on not having a TikTok account. It translates, however, to delusional without a solution. And the Australian opposition isn't the only group that is delulu if it thinks it can get by without help from the Australian government. Because as the International Migration Association warns us just yesterday, climate change is ravaging the Pacific Islands. From Micronesia to Polynesia, sea levels are rising faster than double the global average, leaving the Pacific Islands Forum with a disaster on its hands. In fact, the Pacific Islands Forum itself tells us that 50,000 people are being displaced by climate change every single year, and over 48 million are expected to be displaced in the region by 2050. And it's when considering that currently an El Nino, a global storm system that heats ocean waters and causes sea levels to rise, is brewing, threatening to devastate the Pacific Islands. But also, that the Pacific Islands' response to climate change is a vital blueprint for a problem that none of us can escape. It is high time that we ask the question, how can the Pacific Islands Forum address climate displacement? The answer is clear. It's by responding to key vulnerabilities. By first, offering emergency visas. Second, prioritizing the protection of cultural heritage, before finally improving emergency warning systems. Now, if you asked Anthony Albanese to describe how Pacific Islanders are currently treating their governments, he'd probably tell you that the governments are being ghosted because citizens are leaving their countries en masse, giving us the first way in which the Pacific Islands Forum can respond to climate displacement, and that is by offering emergency visas. The problem is explained to us by the Human Rights Watch in September of 2025, which notes that for those being displaced by flooding in the Pacific Islands, there is literally nowhere to go. In countries like Tuvalu, the entire country sits just a few feet above sea level, making none of it habitable. In fact, one resident of the Solomon Islands recently said to a reporter, "We are just out of land." Under normal circumstances, these people would file for refugee status and claim asylum in another country. However, the United Nations Refugee Protections only applies to those fleeing war or violence, not climate change. That's why the Pacific Islands Forum must act on its own. In particular, The Guardian implores in October of 2025 that countries in the Pacific Islands Forum that are more well-resourced, like Australia and New Zealand, must begin offering emergency visas to those fleeing climate displacement, so that people who don't have a home in the Solomon Islands or Tuvalu, in the interim, at least have somewhere to go if the UN won't come to their aid. Thankfully, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace told us this September that Australia and Tuvalu just struck a first-of-its-kind deal for mobility agreement, but that must be the first of many. Otherwise, Pacific Islanders will simply be left with nowhere to go. But second, as hard as us Gen Zers have worked to protect our slang, it seems to be adopted these days among the adults. I mean, it's just a matter of time before Scott One is talking about how auriful he is. But the second way in which Pacific Islands Forum can respond to climate displacement is by protecting cultural heritage. The problem is explained to us by Princeton University back in October, which highlights that 75% of the population in the Pacific Islands is made up of indigenous groups, whose sites have historically been desecrated and devastated by the international community. Now they're facing double devastation, because these groups have historically sustained their cultures through oral traditions and ties to ancestral lands. As they're displaced by climate change, though, they're removed from those ancestral lands, and as people are scattered across the globe, they lose communication with the elders who know about ancestral traditions and languages. The problem has gotten so dire that today, 82% of indigenous languages in the Pacific Islands are considered endangered or dead. However, the Pacific Island Forum can act to save them. The Georgetown Journal of International Affairs highlights last December that the solution is as simple as the Pacific Island Forum sending delegations to as many islands in the region as possible with nothing but a voice recorder and a camera. Because if they do that, they can actually record ancestral lands and take down languages that people are currently speaking, therefore being able to create, for example, an online database in which people can access the languages that have sustained them for so long. The languages of Pacific Islanders have sustained the entire region for generations. It is time that we do our part in sustaining them. But finally, Gen Zers know a thing or two about red flags. If you're interested in learning more, just ask an LD debater. That's the final way, however, in which the Pacific Island Forum can act to address climate displacement by improving red flags or emergency warning systems. The problem is explained to us by the International Meteorological Association back in January of this year, where they highlight that for 60% of Pacific Islanders, they have no access to double hazard emergency warning systems. In other words, the territory they live in is not covered by infrastructure that would tell them when there's even a flood impending. That makes the impact of climate displacement that much worse, because if you don't know to fortify your home, to prepare your family, you're all the more likely to actually have to move to another country because you didn't know that a storm was brewing. And in the meantime, as the Pacific Islands Forum expands these double hazard warning systems, there is an effective shorter-term solution. In fact, Global Affairs tells us in an article published just 2 weeks ago that over 30% of Pacific Islanders don't have access to cell service. That means they can't doom scroll in the literal sense or in the more metaphorical sense of, learning about impending climate disasters. But the solution then is for the Pacific Islands Forum to transfer all 18 of its countries onto an existing cell service network. That way, people can at least get a notification when a storm is brewing and protect their families and their homes. Doing so would also allow them to safely move to Australia to finally teach Albanese the proper way to use Gen Z slang. Anthony Albanese is right that Pacific Islanders are delulu if they think they can get through the next couple years unscathed. That is why we ask the question, how can the Pacific Islands Forum address climate displacement? The answer is clear. They can respond to key vulnerabilities by, first, expanding access to the systems that will allow people to actually move to new countries, but second, by prioritizing the protection of cultural heritage before finally offering expanded emergency response systems. That way, Pacific Islanders can confidently say that they really do have a Salulu. Thank you.
Speaker number 3 will now be cross-examined by Speaker 2, code 5092.
Congratulations on a fantastic speech. As always, I just have a couple of questions. So let's get straight into it on your first point. A lot of international organizations, including the UN themselves, have recently made major moves to define climate refugees as a form of refugee. So why do these Pacific organizations have to do it themselves?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would actually refer you back to your own question, which is that the UN is making major moves, but it hasn't codified these definitions yet. Sea levels are rising right now, and El Nino is brewing today. Pacific Islands don't have time to wait, so they need to rely on their neighbors. That's exactly why Australia and New Zealand have to start offering these emergency visas. We can't wait until the next disaster and hope that the UN steps in.
Okay, but if the United Nations doesn't protect these refugees, then why would other countries accept them? We've seen in countries like the United States, for example, that were very harsh on immigration in the status quo.
That's a great question. Both Australia and New Zealand are both currently facing declining economic growth thanks to a labor shortage. That means that they actually have a massive incentive to welcome refugees that could help address that problem.
Okay, let's move on to your second point. If all that it takes is a recorder in order to preserve these precious cultural memories, then how come in the status quo, as you explained, 80% of languages are going extinct?
That's because the Pacific Islands Forum hasn't acted yet. That's exactly why I give you the solution. They haven't taken the steps to record these languages, which is why we need to do it now. The fact of the matter is that it's a Herculean logistical task to do so, but it's one that the Pacific Islands Forum is up to. Now is the time to protect the languages that have for so long protected all of us.
Okay, let's move on to your final point. What good are early warning systems if people don't have a way to necessarily flee the country in the necessary amount of time?
Well, they're valuable because people can fortify their homes. If you know a storm is coming, you'll stockpile resources, create protections. That way, even if you don't have somewhere to go, you have a path to survival. But also, I point you back to my first point, which is that if the Pacific Islands Forum offers these emergency visas, then people actually will have somewhere to go.
I believe that's time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Congratulations again.
Speaking fourth is code 5072, answering the question, can the Association of Southeast Asian Nations maintain economic unity amid United States-China competition?
When you think of coffee, the first thing that comes to mind probably isn't poop, unless it's that crappy cup of joe from the judge's room. However, Kopi Luwak coffee, which goes for over $400 a pound, is actually made from the poop of cat-like animals known as civets, who are native to Southeast Asia. I guess you could say, one man's crap is another's coffee. Although sometimes it's just crap, which seems to be the case for the economic unity of Southeast Asia. Indeed, as the Asian News Network contextualizes on June 10th of this year, Recently, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, 11 Southeast Asian countries forming an economic bloc better known as ASEAN, had a meeting, their third ASEAN Future Forum, where they discussed the future of the organization. During that meeting, many leaders emphasized the need to build unity and resilience within the economic bloc, especially considering stagnating growth as well as economic competition between the United States and China. And it's prompted both political pundits and economists within these countries alike to wonder, how can they remain unified in order to ensure their initial goal, providing economic stability for the people of Southeast Asia? Because if they fail to do so, it's 700 million livelihoods in Southeast Asia that are put on the line. That's why it's critical for us to ask today's question. How can the Association of Southeast Asian Nations maintain economic unity amid United States-China competition? The answer, they need to lean into the strengths of their member states and balance their ties, specifically by first, bolstering supply chain integration, second, renegotiating tariffs with Trump, and third and finally, participating in free trade agreements. Now, a few days ago, infamous influencer at NSDA Nats Memes posted on their story, guy in IX finals caught snoring in the prep room. Yeah, so that was me, and I'm sorry if my extemporaneous nap may have disturbed your research. But hey, we all prep in different ways. And we also have a lot bigger problems to worry about, because I'm not the only one sleeping on the job. Southeast Asia has done the same thing. Southeast Asia has done the same thing when it comes to their supply chains. And that's also the first way that they can once again maintain economic unity. It's by integrating themselves into the China +1 supply chain. Malaysia's Institute for Strategic and International Studies explains on May 22nd of last year that the China +1 strategy is used by foreign companies in order to diversify away from China during the US-China economic competition. Specifically, they may have headquarters in China, but they also outsource their manufacturing or resources to other countries. And that's exactly what ASEAN needs to do with their supply chains. Because right now, they're not actively participating in the resource gathering or manufacturing part of it. Yet, one country in ASEAN actually stands out. That's Vietnam. The Vietnam Ministry on Foreign Affairs explains in a March report that Vietnam is actually critical in the China +1 supply chain, not just due to their close proximity, but their abundance of natural resources and their low regulations when it comes to imports and exports. And that's exactly what ASEAN needs to do. It needs to build up its natural resources reserves and also ensure that their regulations are streamlined for other countries. That way, they can be better integrated into the global supply chain, working with each other in order to produce goods and export them to other countries. That doesn't just grow their economy, but their economic unity as well. But as Ronald Reagan famously said, recession is when your neighbor loses his job. Depression is when you lose yours, and recovery is when the president loses his. Thankfully, I'm not depressed because I'm unemployed. If anyone's hiring, I'm in Baltimore in the fall. But it also seems that right now, Southeast Asia is waiting for Trump to lose his job before they lose theirs. And so the second way that these countries can maintain their economic unity is by renegotiating tariffs with Trump. The Diplomat, an Asian newswire, laments on June 4th of this year that 7 Southeast Asian nations, including the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand, had increased tariffs placed on them by Trump at the most recent meeting. That's because Trump alleged that they were continuing unfair trade practices with the United States. However, once again, one country in ASEAN has stood out, that being Vietnam. Because although global logistics company DHL explains in September of last year that Vietnam had a tariff rate of over 46% initially, due to negotiations, they were able to lower that tariff rate. And as Vietnam News proudly boasts in February of this year, that rate is now sitting at just 20%. That's exactly where Southeast Asia and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations can maintain their economic unity. They need to use their leverage as an economic bloc in order to renegotiate their tariffs. Lowering this tariff rate would also grow their economies as well, allowing their people to flourish. But third and finally, it seems that free trade agreements economy into the espresso lane. And it would also help out their economic unity a latte. The third and final way that Southeast Asia can maintain economic unity amid US-China competition is by participating in more free trade agreements. The problem right now is outlined by the International Trade Administration on April 23rd of this year. Southeast Asia only has 5 trade deals as a bloc. Instead, individual countries are negotiating their own individual trade deals. Yet that actually comes at a detriment to ASEAN. The Vietnam briefing explains in March of this year that ASEAN, by not negotiating in trade deals as a bloc, means that other countries like Vietnam or Thailand, who have their own trade deals, are bypassing the trade and the bilateral passages that their countries have, which means that these nations don't see economic growth together, but as individual countries. But once again, by negotiating greater trade deals, which, as Nikkei Asia suggests, should involve the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the European Union, what ASEAN can do is essentially build up its economic growth and also its economic unity, because now all of their trade is done as a bloc. What this means for Southeast Asia is that once again, they're going to see economic growth, but also greater economic unity as they trade together as partners. So when returning to today's question, how can the Association of Southeast Asian Nations maintain economic unity amid US-China competition? The answer, they need to lean into the strengths of their allies and balance their ties by first, bolstering their supply chain, second, renegotiating tariffs, and third and finally, participating in free trade agreements. If Southeast Asia can continue to take these 3 steps, not only can they ensure that their people don't have a crappy cup of coffee, but instead a good dark roast, they can also ensure economic growth and unity for their people.
Speaker number 4 will now be cross-examined by Speaker 3, code 5086.
Congratulations on an excellent speech, as always. I just have a couple of questions.
Of course.
So I want to start with an overarching question. Some countries within ASEAN maintain a posture of strategic ambiguities towards China, while others are overtly pro-China. How can we expect them to overcome this divide when determining what their economic future is?
Well, as I mentioned in my 3 points, the policies that ASEAN should implement balance ties with both the United States and China. On one hand, they're integrating themselves into the China +1 strategy, but on the other, they're also reducing tariffs from the United States and increasing trade with them as a result.
So to clarify, you're expecting pro-China, anti-United States ASEAN members to increase trade with the United States and be enthusiastic about it?
Yes, because it's an opportunity for economic growth for everyone.
Got it. I want to move to your second point about tariffs. You give the example of Vietnam, which has lowered tariffs with the United States. However, Vietnam offers more advanced manufacturing than any other country in ASEAN, thereby offering the United States more benefits. How would other ASEAN countries be able to get the same deals from Trump?
While they may not be able to do it individually, what I'm advocating for is for them to negotiate as a bloc. That's what contributes to economic unity because it gives them leverage as 11 countries together who make up a strong manufacturing base.
What incentive does Trump have to negotiate with the bloc if he already has the deal with the country that provides the most important goods?
Because other Southeast Asian nations like Singapore, Indonesia, and Thailand do still have good manufacturing capabilities.
Got it. And on your third point about free trade is globally on the decline as economic populism takes off. So how can we expect that ASEAN will enter into a new wide range of free trade agreements while countries are increasingly protectionist?
Well, we see nations within ASEAN individually, like Vietnam, already starting to negotiate more free trade agreements with European nations. That's what ASEAN needs to do, but instead as a bloc.
Got it. Congratulations.
Speaking fifth is code 5022, answering the question, how should the European Union approach relations with China?
At a recent G20 conference, European Union leaders attempted to extract concessions out of Chinese President Xi Jinping to make their trade relationship more fair. Unsurprisingly, they failed. And judging by the Wi-Fi at this tournament, it's not the only conference that has disappointed people. But just like the Wi-Fi in the prep room, Xi Jinping kind of does whatever he wants, and that's told the European Union into a real trade hotspot. As The Economist's cover from just 1 week ago contextualizes, as the United States has embraced economic isolationism under Donald Trump and attempted to distance itself from the European Union, it's grown more and more dependent on China, with the EU-China trade deficit approaching $1 billion per day. While this has allowed European consumers to gain access to very cheap Chinese goods, there is worry from international economists that this is rotting European producers from the inside out. Indeed, the European Union's economy is suffering from 2 decades of lost growth, during which time it grew at just a meager rate of 1% per year. Considering not just that the EU cannot afford a third lost decade, but also that with European far-right parties actively taking advantage of anti-China sentiment to just capture their first far-right victory in Germany since 1933 in German provinces. This is about more than just EU-China relations. It's about the future of Europe. And that is why we ask, how should the European Union approach relations with China? The answer is they need to be far more cautious. Specifically, first, by enacting higher tariffs. Second, by leveraging its chemical sector. And finally, by diversifying raw material supply chains. Now, first, Donald Trump has taken tariffs a bit too far, even tariffing uninhabited islands comprised solely of penguins and seals. Somebody took hitting the sea lion way too literally. And while the EU doesn't exactly need to hit the sea lion, it should take some inspiration from Instagram Reels, for China is no longer the EU's twin. And that is the first reason that the EU needs to approach relations with China more cautiously. It needs to enact higher tariffs. As the European Central Bank chronicles in January of this year, Chinese exports to the European Union are rapidly increasing, 14% per year overall, but in specific sectors like electric vehicles, as high as 140% per year increases in Chinese exports to Europe. But that is a problem, for the average Chinese good within the EU is 50 to 60% cheaper than a European product. So even though European consumers are gaining access to cheaper goods, European industrial output is now declining because it's being outcompeted, with output declining by 1.4% per year. With that goes jobs and economic growth. The European Union's economy can no longer afford to flounder. So as the Atlantic Council, an internationally acclaimed think tank, contends in April of this year, the European Union's tariffs don't need to be as high as China's, or rather the United States' 3,500% tariffs against Chinese solar panels. But they should approach further rates like 100 or 200% against uniquely coercive Chinese industries like Chinese electric vehicles. Doing so would allow China to remain in the European Union's economy, so it avoids alienating China, while simultaneously allowing European Union industry to compete, taking the European Union's economy from manufacturing problems to manufacturing products. But second, the European Union has tried to extract concessions out of China by asking nicely. That's kind of the equivalent of hitting China with a "speed, I need this," and expecting them to acquiesce. But if the EU doesn't want its mom to be kind of homeless, then it should pursue the second way of approaching relations with China more cautiously, by leveraging its pharmaceutical sector. The European Council on Foreign Relations further continues. In June of last year, European Union leaders like Emmanuel Macron have sought out a way to enforce European leverage against China, to try and extract concessions out of China to make their trade relationship more fair. But that's mostly looked like instituting new regulations, like regulations against how much China can subsidize its products, regulations which frequently go unenforced, and have failed to provide the European Union with sufficient leverage. But the EU doesn't have to try and invent sources of leverage. Its sources of leverage already exist. Politico chronicles in June 7th of this year, China owns a $1 trillion medical manufacturing industry, which it depends on now more than ever, especially given the collapse of the Chinese property sector. To uphold this industry, China needs to import specialized chemicals from the European Union, chemicals which China can't get anywhere else. So, the European Union should threaten export quotas against China on these specialized chemicals. Doing so would scare China and institute legitimate pressure, gaining concessions out of China like regulations on the Chinese currency or real regulations on how much China subsidizes its products. China might have a strong medical industry, but that could very well be the vaccine that the European Union economy needs. But the third and final way the EU should approach relations with China is by third, controlling and diversifying its supply chains of diversified minerals. The International Institute of Strategic Studies explains, in January of this year, the European Union is pretty much entirely dependent on China for its rare earth mineral supply chain. China comprises 97% of the EU's magnesium and 98% of the EU's rare earth minerals. This is a problem because these minerals are absolute necessities to produce goods within tech, manufacturing, and defense. So if the European Union and China were to be embroiled in greater tensions, say if China was to increase support for Russia's war against Ukraine, China would essentially be able to cripple the European Union's economy with a snap of its fingers. So while given China has near total hegemony over global rare earth mineral supply chains, an absolute decoupling is somewhat unrealistic. The European Union can still at least attempt to diversify. The International Magnesium Association proposes, in March of this year, through the EU's 2024 through 2029 strategic agenda, it's already investing billions into mining critical minerals like yttrium out of the Scandinavian peninsula, which is a good start that the European Union should invest more into. But the EU should also attempt to diversify its mineral supply chains by importing more critical minerals from countries like Israel, Brazil, and Turkey. This would, first, ensure that they are not 100% dependent on Chinese rare earth mineral supply chains, and second, also repair relations between the European Union and countries like Israel and Turkey, with whom the EU has had strained relations with in the past, turning the EU not just into an economically independent bloc, but an economically integrated one. So considering that this isn't just about the EU's economy, with more countries considering leaving the European Union, it's about the future cohesion of the EU itself. It is essential that we answer the question, how should the European Union approach relations with China? The answer is clear. It needs to be more cautious, specifically, be it through tariffs, leveraging its pharmaceutical sector, or diversifying its rare earth mineral supply chains. Though the Wi-Fi at this tournament might not be very reliable, if the European Union starts treating Chinese relations more pragmatically, it can stop asking itself why, and finally gain a secure connection.
Speaker number 5 will now be cross-examined by Speaker 4, code 5072.
Congratulations on a great speech.
Thank you.
Of course, I just have a few questions. Let's start with an overarching question. Does approaching relations with China purely have to do with just the economy? Aren't there other political aspects as well?
Yes, there are political aspects as well, and I do address this integrated throughout my speech. For instance, the reason the European Union should not institute absolute 3,000% tariffs against China like the United States has, which I say in my speech, is because you don't want to politically upset China, but you still want to be growing economically independent from them. My speech balances the economic realist realities of the European Union with political concerns as well.
In that case, let's touch upon your first point regarding tariffs. Considering that last year, when the EU implemented tariffs on yet another one of China's big industries, steel, they got retaliatory tariffs in return that hurt their economy. Won't this just happen again when it comes to other industries?
This is kind of how tariffs work in that there is always short-run harms of instituting tariffs. For instance, the moment you institute tariffs, European consumers are now definitionally buying more expensive products from Europe itself. The point of tariffs is that it's worth it in the long run because economic independence and growth of domestic sectors is something the European Union needs to survive. That's why it has to accept retaliatory tariffs to some extent to maintain its economic unity.
Let's move on to your second point regarding the chemical sector. Considering that China, as you said, has control over 60% of the world's rare earth minerals, if the EU were to impose export controls on the chemical sector, won't they get the same in return when it comes to raw materials?
Not necessarily, because while China does control rare earth mineral supply chains and can do things like export quotas, it really doesn't want to because China depends on these revenues from rare earth mineral exports to gain profits. For instance, that's why even though China has had upset relations with Japan since its recent election, it's not like China has completely abolished exporting rare earth minerals to the country. The same applies to the European Union as well.
Congratulations.
Speaking sixth is code 5093, answering the question, should Japan become a more assertive military actor in East Asia?
Last year, Japanese Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi and Chinese President Xi Jinping finally discussed defense relations between Japan and China, which was honestly real historic. And by historic, I mean historically unproductive. But it turns out that China is far from the only threat to Japan, because as the Associated Press explained just 2 days ago, over the last few months, Japan's adversaries, including North Korea and China, have been becoming increasingly aggressive, for example, with missile tests from North Korea. And that's caused even Japan's own defense minister to say that right now is a critical time to improve Japan's defense capabilities. But that's also raised questions over whether or not Japan should become more assertive in East Asia, or in other words, be doing more for defense intentionally. Because considering that over 120 million people are kept safe by Japan's defense capabilities, and that scale of people grows when we consider other countries, like for example, South Korea, it's because none of these people get a second chance to live that we ask today's question. Should Japan become a more assertive military actor in East Asia? And the answer is absolutely, because they need to deter their adversaries, which we can examine in 3 main areas of analysis. More specifically, first, Japan needs to increase their defensive exports. Second, Japan needs to scale up intelligence operations. And lastly, Japan needs to utilize the right to collective self-defense. At that summit last year between Sanai Takaichi and Xi Jinping, Sanai Takaichi said that she wanted to pursue stable ties with China. I thought only extempors could bluff like that. But But it turns out that to address China being one of the major threats towards Japan, Japan needs to take action. And the first way in which Japan should become a more assertive military actor in East Asia is that Japan needs to increase its defensive arms exports. As the International Institute for Strategic Studies explained in a July 2025 article, in the wake of threats from countries like North Korea and China, Japan has decided to loosen their arms exports restrictions to over 17 countries, like the United States and the United Kingdom. But the issue is that most of these countries aren't in East Asia, leaving most of East Asia unprotected. And that's critical for Japan right now because Japan has to fill in the gap left by other countries within East Asia. For instance, under the Trump administration, the United States has already stated that they are going to be pulling out air defenses within South Korea, which is where Japan needs to fill the gap. As one article published by DSA, an international defense publication, explained in December of 2025, Japan has already developed air defense systems that are capable of intercepting even advanced supersonic missiles. This means that Japan needs to expand its capabilities and become more assertive in East Asia by exporting these systems to other countries like South Korea that are losing critical partners. And if Japan takes this step, it'll keep hundreds of millions of people in East Asia safe. The sea right next to China is known as the East China Sea, and China currently asserts control over it. That's why it's not called the West Japan Sea instead. But it turns out that China is becoming more aggressive in this region too. And the second way in which China should become a more assertive military actor in East Asia is that Japan also needs to increase their intelligence capabilities within the region. That's important because Japan doesn't really know what's going on 100% of the time. As Newsweek explained in July of 2025, that for example, Japan found out that China deployed an additional 20 structures within the East China Sea. Yet Japan was also unable to identify these structures beyond saying that some of them were probably oil rigs. But for Japan to effectively fight against adversaries like China, it needs to know what threats it's even fighting to begin with. That's exactly why Japan needs to become more assertive within East Asia, but in an intentional fashion. As Naval News explained in an article published on February 17th of 2026, one example of how Japan has done this with regards to Southeast Asia is that they've exported 5 radar systems to the country of the Philippines. But they need to implement this same approach within East Asia as well. That way they can figure out what's going on in locations like, for example, the East China Sea. Because if they know what threats they're combating, they're going to be far better suited to even combating those threats, in turn keeping hundreds of millions of citizens safer. But the third and final way in which Japan should become more assertive within East Asia, but in an intentional fashion, is by utilizing their right to collective self-defense. And bear with me here, I know that might sound a little bit paradoxical. As The Diplomat, an Asia Pacific magazine, explained on February 12th of 2026, that in 2014, Japan reinterpreted Article 9 of their constitution, which essentially states that they can't get involved in war. But in that 2014 declaration, they stated that Article 9 could be used for collective self-defense, or in other words, Japan defending its allies. But Japan needs to use that form of collective self-defense to its advantage, because now it can deter adversaries that are trying to attack its own allies. That explains how Japan needs to become more assertive within East Asia. As BBC News explained in November of 2025, countries like China have stated that they could attack Taiwan, and Japan has also stated that they could defend Taiwan, which is why Japan needs a very intentional but more assertive approach here, because they need to sign undercover agreements with countries like Taiwan that accomplish 2 goals. First, preserving their strategic ambiguity that allows countries like China to just not invade Taiwan, but second, also ensuring that countries like Taiwan know they have a fail-safe. Because when questions of independence have remained unresolved for decades and decades on end, it's time that Japan gives citizens at least some sense of normalcy. So as you return back to today's question, Should Japan become a more assertive military actor in East Asia? We saw that the answer was absolutely. Japan needs to do so to deter its adversaries, and we examined how in 3 main areas of analysis. First, by increasing defensive exports. Second, by scaling up intelligence operations. And lastly, by utilizing their right to collective self-defense. Clearly, Japan and China have already done a lot of things that could be deemed historic. But in the future, let's hope that East Asia is kept historically safe.
Speaker 6 will now be cross-examined by Speaker 5, code 5022.
Congrats on a great speech. I want to start with an overarching question. Japan is currently suffering from a budget crisis caused by current conservative president, Sanae Takaichi, simultaneously cutting taxes and increasing spending, all of which while Japan's currency has lost value persistently for the past 2 decades. How can Japan afford to do any of these 3 solutions?
First, Japan could afford these solutions by utilizing debt financing strategies. But even then, I would say that it's far better for Japan to spend money on defense than it is for them to focus on their economy right now. Because if Japan can't deter China, then they're not just going to have their economy, but also the economy of trade partners like South Korea and Taiwan completely wiped out.
Right, but all of that depends on the idea of China actually taking military action against other partners in East Asia. But insofar as China has not done that, and Japan's debt is still actively dramatically increasing, is this something that is at all economically sustainable?
Well, that's why we're asking today's question. You say that China hasn't yet taken military action, which is why I propose the solution of deterrence, which is going to be cheaper than Japan responding retroactively in the long run.
Okay, let's go to your first point then about increasing defense exports. The reason that Japan does not export its frontier defense technology to countries like South Korea is that those countries have far closer ties to China than Japan does. Is exporting frontier technology to countries like South Korea not a national security concern for Japan?
First, I disagree with the premise of your question. I don't think that South Korea and China have especially close relations. But second, that's why I advocate for developing these defensive technologies that have already been innovated. I'm not saying that Japan necessarily needs to invent a new technology and export it to South Korea before Japan can use it themselves.
Right, but South Korean President Lee Jae-myung has actively increased ties with China. Even if China, or rather Japan, is not innovating brand new technologies, this is still placing its best technologies in the glimpse of China. Is that not a national security concern?
I think there's a bigger picture here. It's not that Lee Jae-myung is massively leaning towards China. He's becoming slightly closer, but still wants to preserve South Korea's own defense capabilities, which they can do by cooperating with Japan.
Great speech.
Please welcome to the stage the finalists in ACLE International Extemporaneous Speaking, presented by the Council on Foreign Relations. And would the 6 finalists in Joe and Pam Wyckoff Original Oratory please line up? So the Council on Foreign Relations provides in-depth analysis of foreign policy issues that are shaping the United States and the world. Students can explore current topics through the CFR website, Foreign Affairs magazine, books, task force reports, and other publications. Introducing tonight's winners is tournament official, Mr. Michael Robinson.
Your winners in International Extemporaneous Speaking are, in 6th place, Carter Mack from Gabrielino High School in California, coached by Derek Yule, Eric Chin, and Ethan Lamb. In 5th place, Anushka Gupta from Westwood High School in Texas, coached by Dominic Henderson. In 4th place, Eric Chin from Plano West Senior High School in Texas, coached by Megan Clark, Reggie Chapman, Catherine Lee, and David Houston. In third place, and receiving a $250 scholarship is Anthony Babu from Concord Carlisle High School in Massachusetts, coached by Shannon Babu. Placing second in international extemporaneous speaking, receiving a $500 scholarship is Ryan Zhu from Plano West Senior High School in Texas, coached by Megan Clark, Reggie Chapman, and Dave Houston.
And the national champion in ACLE International Extemporaneous Speaking, receiving a $1,000 scholarship on behalf of the Council of Foreign Relations, is Zoe Becker from School Without Walls High School in the District of Columbia. Zoe is coached by Judy Becker.